He was 69 years old, half blind, and kneeling on a stone floor. The date was June 22nd, 1633. In front of him sat 10 cardinals of the Roman Inquisition. He had been asked to say something he didn't believe. He said it. The words were prepared in advance by the Church. He abjured, cursed, and detested his errors. He swore the earth didn't move. He swore the sun was not the center of the solar system. He had spent 30 years proving the opposite. The cardinals listened. When he finished, they sent him home. The story most people carry is simple: science crushed by religion, reason silenced by power. It leaves out almost everything. It leaves out the painter who hid Galileo's moon inside a papal chapel 20 years before the trial. It leaves out the woman left behind in Padua. It leaves out the job application disguised as a book of astronomy. Galileo was not primarily a solitary genius. In Padua, where he spent 18 years, he ran a household workshop producing mathematical instruments he sold to supplement his university salary. He took private students. He consulted on engineering problems. He was a craftsman as much as a theorist, and the telescope came out of that workshop, not from pure contemplation. He also had a companion. Marina Gamba of Venice moved into his house in Padua and bore him 3 children: Virginia in 1600, Livia in 1601, Vincenzo in 1606. In none of the 3 baptismal records is Galileo named as the father. Virginia's record describes her as daughter by fornication of Marina of Venice. Vincenzo's reads father uncertain. Galileo's position among the Venetian nobility made official paternity inconvenient. In 1610, he published the Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger, announcing his telescope discoveries. He named Jupiter's 4 moons the Medicean stars, after the ruling family of Tuscany. It was not sentiment, it was strategy. Cosimo II de' Medici appointed him chief mathematician and philosopher to the Grand Duke within months. Galileo left Padua for Florence. He took the daughters. He left Marina behind with the 4-year-old son. Marina Gamba died 2 years later in Padua in 1612. She was around 40 years old. Galileo had by then placed both daughters in the convent of San Matteo in Arcetri, near Florence, because they were illegitimate and he could not afford the dowries that marriage required. He had Vincenzo legitimated by the Grand Duke through a legal document. Marina's death went unrecorded in his correspondence. That same year, 1612, his closest friend was finishing a fresco in a papal chapel in Rome. The painter, Lodovico Cardi, known as Tigoli, had been commissioned by Pope Paul V to decorate the dome of the Pauline Chapel at Santa Maria Maggiore. Tigoli painted the Virgin Mary standing on the moon, and he painted the moon as Galileo had seen it through the telescope, cratered, pocked, imperfect. The traditional image of the moon in Marian iconography was smooth and perfect, a symbol of purity. Tigoli painted it with craters in a papal basilica. With the Pope's commission, the Vatican eventually renamed the fresco. It could no longer be called the Immaculate Conception if the moon beneath Mary's feet was visibly imperfect. But they kept it. Galileo's cratered moon hung in a papal chapel for 20 years before anyone put him on trial. Tigoli and Galileo had been friends since youth. They had studied under the same mathematics teacher in Florence. Galileo drew and wrote about art. Tigoli made astronomical observations and confirmed Galileo's sunspot discoveries. Their correspondence runs from 1609 to 1613, the year Tigoli died. and Segoli spent those years keeping Galileo informed about shifting attitudes in Rome, warning him when the mood changed. Galileo was also a trained draftsman. He had studied perspective techniques used by Florentine artists and applied them to what he saw through the telescope: the shading, the inference of depth from light and shadow. His drawings of the moon in Sidereus Nuncius were not just illustrations. They were the work of someone who understood how to read three-dimensional form from a two-dimensional image. His artistic training was part of what he saw. By 1611, the Jesuits at the Collegio Romano had confirmed his telescope observations publicly. Christopher Clavius, the most respected astronomer in Europe, praised Galileo's findings in print. The Jesuit college held a ceremony in his honor, attended by cardinals and Roman nobility. Galileo left Rome celebrated. The church's own scientists had validated him. He had every reason to believe he was safe. What changed the Jesuit relationship was not astronomy. It was contempt. Galileo had a gift for making opponents look foolish in public, and he used it on the Jesuits in the sunspot controversy of 1612 to 1613, taking credit for the discovery and dismissing the Jesuit Christoph Scheiner's work with something close to mockery. Scheiner never forgave him. He spent the next 2 decades working against Galileo inside Rome. The Jesuits went from his most powerful supporters to his most effective opponents, and he helped make that happen. He also had a friend becoming Pope. Maffeo Barberini had admired Galileo for years, written him a poem, met with him 6 times in 1624 alone, after becoming Urban VIII. Galileo took those meetings as license. He came away believing the new Pope would allow him to write about heliocentrism, as long as he treated it as hypothesis rather than truth. He went home and wrote the dialogue concerning the 2 chief world systems. He did not treat it as hypothesis. The dialogue came out in 1632 with church permission, a permission built on assurances Galileo would not keep. It staged a debate between 3 characters: Salviati, who argues for Copernicus, Simplicio, who defends Ptolemy, and Sagredo, who weighs the arguments. The problem was Simplicio. He was a fool, and the theological caution Urban VIII had personally asked Galileo to include, an argument about the limits of human knowledge, Galileo gave to Simplicio to deliver. Urban VIII read this as a personal insult, his own argument placed in the mouth of a simpleton. Whether Galileo intended it that way is genuinely unclear. What is clear is that Urban VIII stopped protecting him. The political timing made everything worse. The Spanish cardinals had been pushing for months to prove Urban was soft on heresy. A trial of the most famous scientist in Europe served their purposes as much as his. Galileo arrived in Rome in February 1633, traveling by litter because he was too ill to ride. He was not thrown in a dungeon. He stayed at the Medici villa, then in a comfortable apartment inside the Inquisition complex with a servant and a view of the garden. The church had no interest in making him a martyr. It wanted a recantation, publicly performed, on the record. A document surfaced in the Inquisition files that Galileo claimed he had never seen. It recorded a much stricter prohibition from 1616, not Bellarmine's informal warning to stop teaching heliocentrism, but an absolute injunction never to hold or defend it in any form. Whether that document was genuine, forged, or altered, nobody has ever proven. It was used against him regardless. The interrogations ran from April through June. Galileo argued the dialogue was balanced, that Copernicus appeared as hypothesis rather than truth. The inquisitors pointed to specific passages. Galileo said he had not realized how strong they sounded. He was shown the instruments of torture, standard procedure, a formal display. Whether they would have used them on a 70-year-old man who was half blind is unclear. The display worked. He signed the confession. The sentence was house arrest at his villa in Arcetri for the remainder of his life. The dialogue was banned. He was required to recite 7 penitential psalms once a week for 3 years. His daughter Virginia, Sister Maria Celeste, the illegitimate child placed in the convent at 13 because he could not afford her dowry, took that obligation on herself. She died 8 months later, aged 33. He rose from his knees. The cardinals dismissed the session. He was taken back to the apartment, and the legend says, has always said, that as he stood, he muttered under his breath, and yet it moves. Eppur si muove. The earth kept going around the sun, regardless of what he had sworn. It is a wonderful line. The first written record of it appears in 1757. He died in 1642. The Eppur si muove story first appears in a book by Giuseppe Baretti, published in London in 1757, 115 years after Galileo's death. A painting supposedly showing Galileo in prison with the phrase inscribed was later dated to before the trial, which is impossible if he said it at the trial. The timeline does not hold. The line was invented by someone who needed Galileo to have been defiant. What the legend does is give Galileo a secret defiance that costs him nothing. He says the true thing under his breath. The Church gets the lie, and he keeps both his integrity and his life. It rehabilitates him without requiring anyone to sit with what he actually did. A man who spent his life building a case for how the solar system works, kneeling on stone and swearing the opposite, because the alternative was worse. Here is what almost every video leaves out. The Inquisition was not primarily afraid of astronomy. Copernican heliocentrism had been around since 1543. 90 years had passed. The Church had its own astronomers, the same Jesuits who had celebrated Galileo in 1611, who knew the geocentric model had problems. The issue was not the telescope. The issue was who gets to interpret what the telescope means. The Reformation had split Europe. Luther, Calvin, Zwingli all argued that individuals could read Scripture for themselves. The Council of Trent answered that the Church alone held interpretive authority. Galileo had written in 1613 that Scripture was not intended to teach natural philosophy, that the Bible's description of the sun standing still was accommodation to ordinary understanding, not astronomical fact. That argument crossed a line the Reformation had drawn. Robert Bellarmine, the cardinal who had warned Galileo in 1616, was one of the sharpest theological minds of the Counter-Reformation. His objection was not that heliocentrism was obviously false. It was that Galileo had no proof, and that without proof, overturning a scriptural reading required a certainty he could not supply. That is a philosophically serious position. Bellarmine told him, "If you get proof, come back." The proof Bellarmine asked for, Galileo didn't have. His strongest argument for heliocentrism, the one he was most proud of, the one he built an entire section of the dialogue around, was his theory of the tides. He believed the tides were caused by the Earth's motion around the sun. He was completely wrong. Kepler had the right answer: the moon's gravitational pull. Galileo called Kepler's explanation mysticism and dismissed it. He also rejected Kepler's discovery that planetary orbits are elliptical, insisting they were circular. Galileo was right about heliocentrism, and wrong about the two arguments he used to support it most confidently. The man Bellarmine asked for proof was arguing his case with a broken tides theory and a geometry that was slightly off. He knew more than anyone in the room. His best weapons were still faulty. The proof came 45 years after his death. Newton's Principia, published in 1687, provided the mathematical framework that made heliocentrism not just plausible but necessary. Newton said he had stood on the shoulders of giants. Galileo was one of them. He went blind in 1638, 4 years before he died, and never knew the argument he could not quite complete would be finished by someone born the year he recanted. House arrest in Arcetri lasted 9 years. He went blind in 1638 but kept working, dictating observations, corresponding with mathematicians across Europe, passing problems back and forth with Cavalieri and Torricelli. His discourses and mathematical demonstrations, smuggled out to the Dutch because the dialogue was banned, was published in Leiden in 1638. It is arguably his most important contribution to physics. He wrote it under house arrest after the recantation. He died in January 1642. Urban VIII refused a public funeral or monument. The Medici buried him quietly in a side room of Santa Croce in Florence, the same church where Machiavelli lay, the same church that would eventually give both men proper tombs decades later, when it was safe to celebrate them. Galileo's proper tomb in the nave came in 1737, 95 years after his death, with a marble bust and full ceremony. 3 of his fingers were removed during the 1737 reburial as relics. The middle finger of his right hand, mounted upright in a glass egg on a marble pedestal at the Museo Galileo in Florence, pointing at the sky. Galileo did not leave instructions. The gesture was arranged by people who needed him to be defiant. It is the same impulse as the secret whisper, made permanent in glass and marble. Some historians argue the recantation was a rational calculation. He was old and ill, and the work left to do could only be done by him. The discourses proved that argument correct. Others say fear is sufficient explanation, that dressing fear up as strategy is another version of the secret whisper, designed to protect us from seeing a great man in an ordinary human moment of weakness. Both readings have evidence behind them. The Church's formal rehabilitation came in 1992. John Paul II commissioned a study in 1979. The commission concluded that the theologians of 1633 had been wrong to condemn heliocentrism. The statement acknowledged an error. It did not say the Inquisition had been wrong to hold the trial. The language was precise, which is its own kind of answer. 359 years, the language was still precise. The real story is messier than the myth needs it to be. A man who left his companion in Padua, who put his daughters in a convent, who humiliated the Jesuits and lost his best allies, who had a pope for a friend and managed to insult him in print, who was right about the solar system and wrong about the tides, who recanted and went home and kept working. The Eppur si muove problem comes up constantly. Someone is pressured into saying something they do not believe, by an institution, a political situation, a professional consequence, and afterward a story circulates that they had their fingers crossed, that the true belief survived intact beneath the performance. Sometimes that is true. Often it is a comfort that protects us from asking what the pressure actually cost. Galileo's case gets used in arguments about scientific consensus and institutional resistance, about who decides what counts as proof. What tends to disappear in those arguments is the specific person, the betrayed friendship, the ambiguous document, the broken tides theory, the daughter who prayed his penance in a convent she entered at 13 because he could not afford her dowry. Both the myth and the argument need him to be simpler than he was. What survived from Galileo is not the recantation and not the secret whisper. It is the method, the argument that you look at things, measure them, describe what you find, and let the description override the prior assumption. That argument didn't win in 1633. It has won, slowly and unevenly, since. He did not live to see it winning. He went blind first, then died, and Newton was born the same year. Sigolli's fresco still hangs in the Pauline Chapel at Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. The cratered moon under the Virgin's feet has been there since 1612. The Church accepted it, renamed it, and kept it. Galileo was put on trial 20 years later. The moon Sigolli painted, imperfect, pocked, exactly as the telescope revealed it, survived the Inquisition in a papal basilica without anyone removing it. The trial did not erase what the friendship had already placed inside the church's own walls. The middle finger points at the sky in Florence. It has been there since 1737. Whether it is defiance or irony, or the accident of which finger someone chose to keep, nobody knows. Galileo did not leave instructions. He left the work, the method, the smuggled book, the letters to a daughter who died before he did. The gesture was added later by people who needed the story to end a certain way.
Thank you for watching. If this video brought you any value, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. For more content like this, hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. See you next time.